I think we're ready to go, gang. Everyone seems to be here. The Kilo small group is attempting, doing its best, but we're going to try to jump in and get started. I guess if we continue to have technical difficulties, just try to do it from individual phones or something, because you'll be able to see us, maybe you'll be able to hear us that way. Keep having technical difficulties. But that is the nature of it, and that's okay. We're continuing tonight in what has been what's going to be a 5-week little series of classes or conversations, whatever you want to call it. We've not done stuff like this in the past, but we're trying to find a way to address some of these topics even while we're kind of away from one another. It's kind of an interesting season that we're in as believers and as the church. So we actually want to be having these conversations now and not waiting until the moment has passed. And so we began all of this in our first week talking really about the history of slavery in our country and the way in which it's really foundational to our nation becoming a global power. Our country would not be what it is without slavery, and all of that, in that it's foundational. We have to acknowledge that just because slavery is gone, that does not mean the roots of racism in our nation are gone and that they don't still have very lasting effects. And so we have to acknowledge that. We have to deal with that in the conversation on reconciliation, especially in the church. Last week, Jonathan dealt with the ways in which the church has been historically complicit in all of this and the ways in which the church has constantly found a way to sign off on this. We found ways to rationalize it with Scripture. We found ways to rationalize it socially and individually as believers. And it's something we do very often, even now. And we have to begin to recognize it and see it, and it becomes really important. So Jonathan talked about that last week. And this week, we're going to look really kind of at the history between the end of the Civil War, emancipation for slaves who had been enslaved, now freed to pursue some semblance of equality in our nation, and what that looks like. Because for a lot of people, there is this gap, I think, that's left in our minds, and that's because of history class. There's a gap in our minds between emancipation of slaves and the civil rights movement. We forget all that was happening in between. And then there's another gap after the civil rights movement and where we are right now. We get lost in between those spaces, and it's helpful to be able to draw the kind of the dots here and connect all of these different points historically so that you can see that there is this continual trend, this thread that you can trace throughout our history. And so tonight, I want to kind of look at a few different ideas. Number one, Reconstruction. It's a time in our history a lot of people don't know a lot about. We recognize some things about it, but for the main part, we only know kind of the surface level of what was happening in Reconstruction. The other thing I want to talk about is the vocation of freed slaves in this scenario. What does it look like for a man who's been freed, a woman who's been freed, to pursue a vocation? A means of providing for their families, a means of sustenance and provision. What does that look like in this time frame? I want to talk about Jim Crow. A lot of people are familiar with segregation, but not really much more beyond that. We want to talk about all of this and how all of that really connects us to ultimately what is the civil rights movement that we're also familiar with. But after that, I want us to try and see this gap that has existed for so long closed. We want to see the ways in which what has happened between the civil rights movement's end, really, in the late 60s, early 70s, and where we're at now, and all the things that have happened here. There's a way of bridging it. You can see this thread there, and that's what we want to do as well. So, Reconstruction, just beginning. And if you guys ever have like a question, if there's something that comes up or if something's wrong as we're doing this, y'all just let us know. But we'll try to move through this fairly quickly. I just want to spend a few minutes on each particular idea. Reconstruction lasts from the end of the Civil War till really the late 1870s, the end of Grant's presidency. Ulysses S. Grant, you know him from the Civil War. He was the famous Union general. He becomes the president, and it's the end of his presidency that really marks the end of Reconstruction as we know it. The way it all plays out historically is in the period following the Civil War, the Northern government knew, Abraham Lincoln had known this, and Andrew Johnson, his successor, knew that the only way the South was going to become the society people were expecting it to become would be through federal oversight, right? So what they did was they created this federal occupation of the South. Just like we still have troops in Germany, just like we still have troops in Afghanistan, we still have these active soldiers in these kinds of places. Same thing exists. We create a means of occupying the South. The government sends in soldiers to enforce these new laws that have been put in place. Now, that seems like a reasonable solution, but it's completely unsustainable. And so it's a very short-lived phase as a result of all this, because obviously people in the South are not okay with this. They're not comfortable with the way it's all playing out. But in the middle of this very short-lived phase, some incredible things happen, okay? In the beginning, General Sherman, who's very famous, created a deal with freed slaves, asking them what they wanted. And they said simply, we want land. We want a place to provide for our families. And that became, the famous 40 acres and a mule agreement. The idea was that every freed slave would be given land. All of this abandoned land, all this land that was not rightfully, had not rightfully been owned, had been abandoned by Confederates who'd left during the war, some of which had been repossessed by the government and all of this. That land was to be given to these slaves. Now, as you probably know, cynically, that did not actually happen. There was a section of land along the Atlantic coast where that did actually happen. It's incredible. They were given land and they began to provide for themselves, but eventually that land was all taken back by its original owners. Andrew Johnson allowed that to happen. Everything was kind of like unraveling. Now, one of the cool things that had happened in Reconstruction was there was this organization called the Freedmen's Bureau, established by the government. And what was happening during this time is the Freedmen's Bureau effectively, still working? Audio, okay. Well, that's all right. It's okay. So the Freedmen's Bureau steps in as an arm of the government to try and help establish this, again, unique experiment, this unique society, a biracial sort of society. And the Freedmen's Bureau steps in and has all kinds of ideas. They're coming alongside these freed slaves, these African Americans who are trying to make their way. And ultimately, one of the mistakes they make is what we've come to call sharecropping. Rather than these people being given the land that they were promised, instead they become tenants on land that belongs to someone else. And you're probably familiar with sharecropping. The idea is simply that, yes, you get to work this land, but you don't get to keep all of the crop. You give upwards of 50% of it to the land's owner. That's how you pay your rent, in effect. Not only that, you've got to find a way to pay for the equipment. You got to pay for the materials to build your house. All of these things are expenses that these people are dealing with. And the problem is, sometimes the landowner would say, you can't buy from anybody else but me. And he would jack the prices up. The difference between white sharecroppers and black sharecroppers is that white sharecroppers had a way out, a means of escape very often. In my family, that was a cousin of the family who came along, who was not wealthy by any means, but was able to come alongside and say, I have enough money to buy this back from the bank. And you don't have to continue to give your crop to them. You don't have to share your profits with them. I'll give you essentially an interest-free loan. And that's the way it all plays out. My family manages to get their farm back, and the rest is kind of history. They end up doing well. My dad ends up going to college. I end up going to college. And you can trace all of this back to some cousin who was able, who was connected enough, who was wealthy enough to be able to step in and say, let me help. But African Americans didn't have that same opportunity very often. It would have been rare for them to have somebody in their family that was capable of doing that, because the people in their families would have been in the same position they were. It was hard for them to escape. They could never really build wealth. They could not flourish. They couldn't provide for their families very well. Another thing that made life very difficult for African Americans during this same phase, after Reconstruction ends, you have the beginning of what we call Jim Crow law. Jim Crow is just a phrase. It refers to kind of like an old comedy routine, an old minstrel routine, and Jim Crow was a fictional character in all of it. But Jim Crow refers mostly in people's minds to segregation. When we think of Jim Crow, we think of segregated buses and schools. We think of segregated businesses and bathrooms, whatever it might have been. Those are the things that come to mind. But Jim Crow was far more widely encompassing than that. It went much deeper than that. And you have to think about all the ways Jim Crow kind of affected the lives of an African American. The worst sort of effect of Jim Crow was the very real domestic terrorism that existed. We would call it domestic terrorism. We don't call it that historically, but that's exactly what it was. Because there were a number of people who were lynched during this phase. There were people who were convicted without judge or jury, without any sort of trial, and they were hung or they were burned alive. They were tortured very often. This was a common thing. We took a trip a few years ago to the Memorial for Peace and Justice down in Montgomery. If you've never been, you should go. You should go as soon as you possibly can. I know right now it's kind of crazy. You should go. It's one of the best things we've ever done, and it's important, I think, for anybody. But there were a number of lynchings that were happening. There were these times where people were deciding that the law was not doing enough and they had to take the law into their own hands. And that became normal during the Jim Crow phase, and without any sort of with impunity, I should say. There was no punishment for it. They could get by with these sorts of things. If you've never looked up the Tulsa race massacre, you should look it up. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it tonight, but large numbers of black people were murdered, and not for very good reasons, because of false accusations, because of hunches, decisions that were made on the spot, and suddenly there were parties hunting for black men in Tulsa. And they destroyed what was known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Look it up. If you've ever heard of the Rosewood Massacre, it happens in Florida, not far from where I grew up. There was a little town called Rosewood. It was mostly black, and on the hunch that a few black men were flirting with women, were thinking of sleeping with white women. Some of them thought that they had raped white women. There were all kinds of accusations always thrown around about black men. And so they began to hunt black men in Rosewood. They burned down homes, and effectively Rosewood was abandoned after that. All those black families that had lived there left. They fled in fear. These sorts of things happened over and over again. You should look these up. Tulsa, Rosewood. Look at the long list of lynch mobs throughout our state's history and all throughout our country. It's not just the South. This was happening everywhere. And the other thing you see continually happening following Reconstruction in this Jim Crow phase is the deterioration of voting rights. They had been promised they'd be able to vote, but again, because the ambiguous language of these amendments, what inevitably happens is people say, oh, well, you still have to be literate to vote. And so they'd put literacy tests at polling places and require that these uneducated, once slaves, would have to pass this literacy test. It was impossible. They knew they wouldn't be able to, and that was the whole point. There were poll taxes that they would never have been able to pay. And so many black people just didn't bother. They couldn't. There was no way they were actually going to be able to vote. All of this is being taken from them. At the time, you have the process we call gerrymandering all starting. It actually starts in the north, interestingly, in Massachusetts, in one particular political race. But if you're not familiar with gerrymandering, I think most of you probably are, but for those of you who aren't, it's just when people look at a map and they divide up this map, put boundaries in the map to find a voting district that is most favorable to them. So you look at a concentration in a city of your party's opposition. You say, this is the Democrats, and this is where they're mostly located. So what we're going to do is to divide that portion of the city into a bunch of different parts and intermingle it with all these other parts of the city where there are lots of our party. And so there's this way in which you can guarantee yourself a win. Gerrymandering is a very complex way of, again, removing the vote from African Americans. The other thing that we're probably most familiar with is segregation, right? You're familiar with Rosa Parks. You're familiar with what it looked like when people showed up at the school doors looking to integrate because the federal government said they'd be able to, and there were all these Southern segregationists who blocked the doors saying, no, I won't let it happen. It's famously happened at the University of Alabama. So you're familiar with that, but what you may not be familiar with is it wasn't just schools and buses and businesses and all of this. It was neighborhoods. Neighborhoods became segregated as well. In a city like Birmingham, there was a practice called redlining. It happened all over the country. Redlining is very much like gerrymandering, but redlining is not about voting districts. Redlining is about creating neighborhoods and establishing neighborhoods that are considered desirable versus undesirable. In Birmingham, you can look it up. Look up redline maps of Birmingham, Alabama, and you'll see it. There are neighborhoods that are listed as desirable, and then those that are slightly less desirable, but people are still seeking after living there. And then there are others that are maybe deteriorating. And below there's another category. Those neighborhoods are dangerous. But there was another category given as well. Neighborhoods of high Negro concentration, it'll say. There were these neighborhoods where they recognized a number of African Americans lived there, and banks refused to give loans to people who wanted to buy houses in those neighborhoods. They weren't a safe bet. They weren't a good investment in the eyes of banks. So in the neighborhoods where an African American could afford to buy a house, the bank wouldn't give them a loan because it wasn't a safe investment. So in these deteriorating or dangerous or predominantly black neighborhoods, they never were able to buy and own a house. And if you can't own a home or own land, it's hard for that investment to appreciate and for you to ever accumulate wealth, for your family to have anything to pass on to their children. And so these families just stay in the same cycle of poverty over and over again. We don't realize that, though, that many of the neighborhoods we live in now were once segregated. Not formally necessarily, but under the table. In these subtle ways, blacks were kept out of these neighborhoods. Even real estate agents participated in all of this. They knew that they could not bring an African American person to see a house in certain neighborhoods. They knew that was against the rules. It was an understood reality. And so they were segregated even from decent neighborhoods where their kids could be in decent schools and where their property values would actually go up rather than down, where they could actually buy a house and get a mortgage loan. It's a really sad reality. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is when the civil rights movement begins, it calls into question all of this, all of these practices, in particular segregation, obviously, but the intimidation of voters, the lack of African American presence in government, their lack of representation, all of this stuff is called into question. And after the civil rights movement, a lot of that changes. So much changes. And the problem, though, for us is just like we assume when slaves were freed that everything was better, we assume the same thing. Just like we assumed that about Reconstruction, things just got better. We assume that about the civil rights movement. Things just got better for blacks. And that's true. There has been so much progress that has been made, and we ought to celebrate the progress that has been made, but we can't neglect to acknowledge all of the other places where things have kind of gone backwards. Because something happened during this phase as well, right? One of the things we didn't talk about post-Reconstruction was this establishment of vagrancy laws, of black codes. People would write laws that were really pretty arbitrary. They would put men in jail simply because they were loitering, because they didn't have a job. There were some places in which every year they would come around to all of these black families, and if a man was not working at the beginning of that year, if he didn't have a job, if he wasn't contributing in that way to the economy and to that society, they thought he belonged in prison. It was a way of keeping blacks under the thumb of whites. And that's the beginning of what we call, mass incarceration or the school to prison pipeline. It begins all the way back really at the end of Reconstruction. A man could be arrested not just for not working, but just for looking at somebody the wrong way. Without a trial, without a judge, without a jury, they could be convicted and find themselves in jail or prison, or even worse, they could find themselves in one of these convict leasing camps. I don't know if you're familiar with that. You're familiar with chain gangs, right? We've seen chain gangs. They're throughout the movies, but you may not be familiar with convict leasing camps and how they worked. There was a void in the South, remember? There had always been free labor, and there were all these men who owned land who needed people to work that land for them. And how were they to go about getting laborers? This became a very easy way of getting free labor, or at least cheap labor, I should say. Instead of having to pay these men, you just had to pay the state. You just had to pay this convict leasing camp, and they would give you slaves. These men had lost their rights, right? They broke laws. This is the way we think about prison. I don't know about you. I grew up thinking that way. I'd hear somebody talk about prison reform, and I would think to myself, why should we reform prison? Prison is supposed to be about punishment. Aren't people who break the law supposed to lose their rights? Why would we make things easier on them? And this all comes from this mindset. And so you have men who lease out prisoners to work for them. The danger in that is if you don't own that man, if you have no investment in that man, then you have even less need to take care of him than you would one of your own slaves. And so they're neglected at a different level than even slaves very often. And there's like a very serious mortality rate among convict leasing camps for this reason, because these slaves were treated this way. And for pretty arbitrary reasons, for pretty small laws that were broken, sometimes not even very real laws, things that had just been kind of thought up creatively by racists. So all of this, relatively speaking, doesn't last long. The chain gang, that the convict leasing camp is eventually made illegal. That cannot happen any longer. But the thing you can't avoid, and again, here's where we have a gap in our minds between civil rights and where we are today. What we don't remember is that in the 70s, our prison population looked completely different than it does now. When we began to illegalize things like convict leasing camps and all that, once we found ourselves with this void, what are we to do with African American males? What are we supposed to do with them? If they don't have jobs, they don't have a means of providing for themselves, if they're getting in trouble, what are we supposed to do with them? Even if they're not getting in trouble, if they're just a nuisance in our eyes, if we don't trust them, what are we supposed to do with them in the meantime? And if you watch the numbers, in the 70s it was like 350,000. That was our prison population. And today it's 2 million. Like that's an insane kind of a ballooning effect. It grows so quickly, and people don't always recognize that it's connected. Maybe that's just a coincidence, some would say. Maybe that's because our population has grown. Our population has not grown like that. And the thing we're left to accept is that this pattern of mass incarceration of black males is very connected to things we don't even recognize it. In our minds, it's not connected there, but in its beginning, its roots are in racism very often, and we need to see that. We need to recognize that the reason our prison population is the way it is because of these old mindsets, this racist way, this distrust of blacks in our country. Black males now have a 1 in 3 chance of being in prison. In Washington, D.C., look it up. I can't remember what it is. Look up in Washington, D.C., the chances of a male. I want to say it's like 4 out of 5. It's insane. I don't want to misspeak. So look it up. The incarceration rate for black males in Washington, D.C. is insane. And there are other cities where it's particularly bad, but you should look. And most often they're being convicted for pretty small crimes, but they're repeat offenders, right? We passed all these laws for repeat offenders. Very often it's drug offenses that are pretty small. It's possession. It's intent to sell or to sell, whatever it is. Maybe they're just addicted because they've lived in a neighborhood for a long time that's had drugs pumped into it. Their entire lifetime, addiction has just been the norm, and they're put in prison because they're suffering an addiction. We watch it happen. I have people, friends in this city who've been in jail because they're mentally ill and they don't know how to live on their own. They don't know what that looks like, and they find themselves in the prison system. Our society doesn't know what to do with poverty, and so a lot of times we just throw those who are poor and demonstrating poverty in their behavior, we just throw them into prison. We throw those who are suffering with addiction into prison. We throw those who've broken these very minor laws into prison where they're not being reformed, but where they're being thrown into this cycle of recidivism, right? They're going to repeat again. They're going to get out of prison and they're going to repeat again. It's this vicious cycle. And to some extent, we're responsible. These old mindsets, this old way of seeing things, it's all connected. You've heard of the war on drugs. We grew up in that. I grew up in that. I still remember the name of my DARE officer. He's the chief of police in the town I grew up in now. He's a good man. But that whole program taught us that drugs were bad. McGruff, the crime dog, taught us that drugs were bad. And the thing you can forget is that all of that had this very disproportionate effect on black males. Blacks suffered under these laws that were passed, and they seemed like they were good, right? We got to crack down on crime. We need law and order and all this sort of language that was used, and not all of that is bad necessarily. There are plenty of people who are in jail who belong in jail, and our society will never find a way of getting away from that. But we have a way of throwing out all of them at once. It's a baby with the bathwater sort of scenario, where so many young African American males who needed help were just thrown in jail because it was easier to deal with them there. They were a nuisance and they needed to be dealt with, and the war on drugs has had this huge role in all of this. All of this is connected. There are all these gaps in our minds that we miss. When slaves were freed, racism didn't end, neither did oppression. There were all of these systemic modes of oppression, and it's just evolved. It's become more and more subtle. Yes, progress has been made. We get rid of slavery. We get rid of this sort of suppression of voting to an extent. Even now, we still see it. We get rid of Jim Crow laws. But then there are all these more subtle ways of being racist. It's still hard for African American people to be able to get loans very often. They struggle with trying to find a way to get their credit to a good enough place that someone will give them a loan because their families have historically lived in poverty. They suffer. They take out a loan, a predatory loan from Easy Money or whoever else you've seen. Drive through poor neighborhoods in Birmingham and look at all the predatory loan businesses that are everywhere. We have to kind of like trace the thread. All of this is still affecting people. And that, again, this is not about making us feel guilty. It's about making us aware. It's about opening our eyes. And when we can begin to see that, we can begin to try and intervene. We can begin to try to speak out and vote differently. We can begin, as the church, to think differently about how we're doing outreach and mission in our own city, about who we're supporting, about how we're trying to help people, what helping even looks like in these kinds of scenarios. We think about the people who come to us and how we're to steward them well, the people in this city that we're surrounded with. Like all of that becomes really important. This conversation means that we have to understand what's happened historically. We have to become more familiar with it. We have to acquaint ourselves with it a bit better. And so, yeah, that's kind of the heart of tonight. That's what we want to do. We kind of want to open up for conversation. If you've got questions, if you've got comments about what we're talking about, if there's something I said that you'd like us to say more about, if there's something I didn't say you were hoping I would say something about, feel free to interject. Feel free to ask us to share on that. Whatever that looks like, we'd be glad to. Whatever questions you might have or whatever you might add to the conversation, we would love to hear in these moments. So we'll just kind of open it up. And if there's not a lot, we'll just kind of close it out. But you guys feel free to speak up. I think we're good then. If you guys come up with questions, if you have ideas that you'd like to share, if something comes up at any point. I hate we lost our small group, I think, because of the rain. I would love to hear those comments. If you have questions, if there are particular topics you'd like us to deal with over the coming weeks, we still got 2 more weeks in all of this, and we'll continue the conversation, continue to kind of explore this, and try to delve deeper and deeper into all of this in the time that we have. We're excited about it. Jonathan and I have enjoyed getting to read and do the research and put this stuff together, and we'd love to be able to serve you guys better in this regard. So if you guys have ideas, if you have questions that you'd like us to kind of deal with, topics, we would gladly do so. Oh, we have something?
Had a text message question. And the question was, during Jim Crow, was the church still segregated? Or did it segregate during that time?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the church, there's still not really been a phase where the church was unsegregated, is what most people would say. I mean, obviously there are churches that are more diverse, but during this phase, absolutely. I mean, I have stories from my own childhood of people walking into my church and men saying to them, it's like, one of the famous stories for me that sticks out in my memory is a man named Mr. Gene. He was a World War II vet looking at a black woman who was worshiping in our church and leaning over to her and saying, you know they have churches for you as well. I mean, it's like, this is a standard thing. That's in the late 90s, maybe that might have even been the early 2000s that sort of stuff's being said. There are still strange looks. I have a friend in Texas who just last week is telling me about a man who walks into his church. One of his neighbors who just moved into the neighborhood, a black man, walks uninvited into their church. He's so excited to see him sitting in the back, and he knows the reason the man walks out of his church halfway through the service. He's like, it's got to be bad news. Sure enough, he talks to him later that week, and he says, I just got some looks, man. I'm used to it, and I realized I was making people uncomfortable, so I left. That's like a standard thing. So it's like that is still very real. That's still everywhere. I would think that's throughout the country. And a lot of that is not because, again, this is not about laws. Right now, it's much more subtle than that. It's beneath the surface. And a lot of that is because we've been apart for so long that different worship traditions have formed, and people just aren't willing to bend on any of that. People aren't willing to compromise. Very often what it looks like for a church to become desegregated or integrated, if you wanted to use that kind of language, what it looks like is we invite African Americans to come be a part of our worship experience and do it our way. Like you're going to have to kind of like jettison your theology and your worship style at the door to an extent, and you can come and take up our better theology and traditions. And that's the way it has looked for a very long time. So we have to keep that in mind in all of this. Like whatever it means for the church to be unsegregated, it will be more than just the church saying, okay, everyone is welcome, which is what a lot of times we do. Like we're not racist, right? We talked about this a couple weeks ago, the notion of like the church has to become anti-racist. The church has to begin to advocate for these people to be in their church, right? If you want African Americans or minorities in your church, to some extent we have to advocate for them. You can't just like wish and hope that it's going to come true. You can't simply even pray about it. Like we have to begin to move on it and ask that when the Lord does bring people into our doors, like we're actually prepared to steward them well, to shepherd them well, to take advantage of an opportunity He's given us to see real reconciliation happen. And that's what we're not very good at. We're not willing to try and like bend a little bit and do some things that might make us uncomfortable, that might make them feel much more welcome. And that's what has to happen. So it's like there's nothing formally that's keeping African Americans and whites from being in church together. There's just this huge sort of hill that has to be gotten over. There's this huge struggle. And it just sits beneath the surface. It goes unsaid. Nobody knows how to really put a finger on it. It's just there. But certainly, yeah, during Jim Crow, churches remained segregated, and it was made to an extent, it even gets more intense during Jim Crow. Remember, like there was this phase where it's like it seemingly kind of got better. But Jim Crow, it's like there was a fear that developed in the white mind because there were so many blacks and were now no longer under the control of the whip. If you think about it, right? You could control all of those people. The masses that you were afraid of, they were in chains. But what happens when they're freed? There was a very real intimidation in the minds of whites. And so they had to find a way to terrorize. They had to find a way to keep them in their place. And in the church, that was no different. You had to make clear that this is not a place where you're welcome. So yeah, during Jim Crow, that was alive and well. So
then we got another question.
Okay.
Is it like then cultural tourism, or I guess you could say like cultural appropriation maybe, if you then try to like go to these black churches for just the experience of going to the church? Is it something that kind of violates that community by just kind of participating in it, or how do you handle that, I guess would be, is it something that people should consider trying?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think what we have to avoid more than anything is tokenism. The best arguments I've ever heard, like the temptation in the white church is normally not, I'm going to leave my white church and I'm going to go find a black church. Truth is, you would be welcomed with open arms, right? I mean, just look at the story of Emmanuel Church in Charleston, right? Dylan Roof walks in the door and they're like, do you want to pray with us? Like they're excited, right? This is an incredible story, right? That's unfolding before their eyes. They're thinking, here's white dude and he wants to pray with us. And he does. He prays with them right before he shoots them, right? Like that happens. There are so many churches in this city, just like there are black people who walk into our church and are completely welcome. Like I'm thankful every day for that reality, that I don't have a church full of people that look awkwardly at someone who's different when they walk in the door. Over the years, we've had some very interesting characters walk in the doors and people lovingly embrace them. That's cool. But in terms of like whether or not you need to go into that, and I don't think we need to be afraid of cultural appropriation. Obviously, it can become like a sort of voyeurism or tourism or something like where we're just kind of like, we're like peeping Toms. We just want to see what the experience is, but we don't really want to be a part of it. We wouldn't want to actually take that sort of burden upon ourselves. But I don't think it's always that. I think it's certainly worth it to expose ourselves to these worship traditions and to try to surround ourselves with people who can teach us something that we've never been exposed to. Like there are a lot of black theologians that we don't know. There are a lot of black preaching traditions. Jonathan and I both learned preaching from an African-American preacher who taught us how to preach in a very different way than we had been accustomed to. And all of that came from his tradition. I would never have known that were it not for him. I would not have been taught that way. I was taught preaching by another professor who was white, and he taught me things that I value as well, but it was not that, and that came very specifically from that tradition. And so, yeah, we can absolutely embrace that. And for a white church to start playing music that doesn't sound white at all, I don't think that's appropriation. I think it is when we just begin to play music that way without any intentions of really allowing people to become a part of the life of the church. But yeah, I think we should feel freedom in those sorts of things, exploring other traditions, allowing others to bring their traditions into our church. That's a big part of who we are. And being interdenominational, we want people to bring that stuff in the door with them. But we also want to feel comfortable stepping into other settings. I don't think that would be appropriation at all.
I would also add right now, too, in the midst of something that we're experiencing, early on, I remember Drew Duvall and I had a conversation of, I don't ever get the chance as a pastor to visit other churches and to see what other people are doing. And one of the things I lament in that is that I don't get the chance to expose myself to people that worship differently than I do, that preach differently than I do. And I go out of my way, and I know you do as well, Kyle, to listen to sermons from people that are very different than us. But before COVID-19 and this global pandemic, that was as far as we were really able to go. Mm-hmm. And now, one of the things that you and I have both found, I think, really kind of fun almost, and really, really helpful for us as a smaller church, is to get the opportunity to actually sort of watch how a lot of these churches do worship and how they do some of the flow of their sermons. And so I would encourage people listening and partaking in this class, like, if that is something, if you've never found yourself in those spaces where people are completely different and other than you, and you genuinely want to partake in that from a honest space and an honest place of wanting to learn and hear more from those places, then like right now you have literally almost every church out there, from new to old, I mean across the whole spectrum. Everybody's online, and their whole service is online right now, and it's a really cool opportunity to learn from people. And sometimes that's, you and I talk about it a lot, Kyle, but it's sometimes even people that they look the exact same as us, but they still have a lot to offer us, just in the fact that they do things differently than us, and they do things in a different approach. And we've said that that's something we want to value at Mosaic, is that we could find a way to, even for people that look like us, that we could respect one another's traditions in such a way that we're not appropriating them or just kind of like, oh yeah, here, we'll throw you a bone, but really saying like, let me learn from this. Let me find a way. And this whole conversation's a really fine line when it comes to different cultures, because you can, and I think it's like a lot of things in life, it's a heart issue. Finding, like, I mean, you know in your heart, and I say this phrase, and I've heard you say it too, but like, if you can be honest before yourself and before the Lord and those that are nearest to you, then like, I mean, I think that's the only thing you can really do, is to try to learn and to grow and to expand in those areas. And so, I think it's a good thing to do, to expose yourself to those different traditions as much as possible.
Yeah. Absolutely. Again, during this season, we've talked a lot about picking up black authors. I've been doing that and thoroughly enjoying it. Books I've intended to read for a lot of years, but just never got around to, foolishly, and have been finding them immensely fruitful. We have a little section online of resources, some book titles, and it's not hard. I mean, if you guys Google search, man, there's a blue million people right now who are, I mean, try to find some of these books in the library right now, and you won't, because people are reading them, just going crazy. I was listening to an interview on the radio just now on the way here to somebody who's talking about what it's like to be a bookstore right now, because they have so many people who are trying to order all of the same titles, because our whole country is engaged in this conversation right now because we're sitting at home so much. It's like suddenly it's like, well, I need to fill my time, and here's a good way. Like, I need to learn some of these things that I wasn't taught. I need to learn some of the ways that I've subtly been oppressive myself, or, like, again, I know that you don't feel like you're outwardly racist. I don't either, right? And yet, there are these subtle ways in which the church has engaged in it, and there are ways that we can, reconciliation looks like sacrifice, especially on the behalf of the white church. Like, how do we begin to sacrifice so that we can try to make a way, make amends, so that we can make people feel comfortable and loved and welcome? That's a sacrifice that needs to be made on our end and not just theirs. And for a long time, we've asked them to shoulder that burden. And so we have to be aware about that. Other messages? Other questions? brilliant thoughts? Cool. Well, we thank you guys. We're glad you're here. Feel free, again, to reach out to us if you have desires, if you have ideas for where this can continue to go. Jonathan and I just continue to sit week after week and talk through these things ourselves and plan it. Oh, wait.
We got one on
Here it comes.
in the final hour. What are some specific ways that we think Mosaic could attempt to integrate them more?
Yeah. One of the things we've been attempting, I was talking with Mia about this the other day. She had asked about, playlist of a certain kind of music. I've toyed around with trying to have melodies in songs. Some of that means we're listening to music written by people who aren't white. And one of the fears for me years ago, okay, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. What I should say is, in the white church, preaching is of paramount importance, right? It is the height of the significance of what we do, right? Everything is moving toward preaching. In the black church, the thing you have to understand is that worship is at the heart of the thing. And we all understand that. If you've spent any time whatsoever, if you've been exposed in any way, any capacity to the African American church, worship is central. And in the white church, it doesn't mean there aren't obviously very expressive, charismatic white churches. There absolutely are. But the thing that we miss very often is that in every African American church, worship is so important. And so I think that becomes like one of the clearest places. And in some sense, that means that puts the onus on me and Drew to like try and find ways to do this. And Drew has been great about it. Drew is always trying to delve into different sort of styles and attempting things. For me, that intimidated me for years. I can remember conversations where people were like, why don't we play more music like that? You could do that. And I'm like, yeah, you say I can, but I'm pretty white. I grew up in a very diverse place. April and I grew up in a town and in a high school. All of our schools were always 50-50, black and white. I grew up in a very soulful sort of culture. All of our sporting events were like this. I grew up very well acquainted with African American culture, and yet I still feel real white, right? And when it comes to music, it's just I don't know that I can do that. And it's taken a lot of years for me to be like, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. I think to some extent, we have to be trying these things. Dr. Smith taught us in terms of preaching. One of the things he taught us about preaching is that preaching is doxological. Doxological is a fancy way of saying it's about moving us toward worship. So you can begin to see, again, in the African American church, everything has to be moving toward worship. Worship is central. And if the sermon is not moving me toward worship, if it's merely moving me toward reflection or contemplation, like often has a place in the white church, that we're completely comfortable with that. We just want to think through it. We want to pray through it. And it's a very quiet and sort of, what would you call it? There's something very somber about those moments very often for us. In the African American church, it's they'll take you there, but they're going to bring you back up. They want you to know that. It's this is the way they understand things. You have to move people toward doxology, toward worship. And if you're not doing that, then you're failing in the sermon. And so he used to tell us we need to be moving people toward eschatological hope. We need to be moving people toward the hope of the coming king, the hope of the kingdom being established in its fullness. And you'll hear that in the way Jonathan and I try to preach. You'll hear that in the way we talk about gospel and about the kingdom. We want those things to be represented in our preaching. And I think some of those things are small ways, but I think the church sometimes assumes that's the only thing we can do, right? If we play more music that feels a little bit more kind of open and inviting, if we preach maybe a little bit differently to try and make people feel a little bit more comfortable, then that'll be enough. And it's just not. Again, that's another form of tokenism. We're kind of giving a nod in their direction, doffing our cap and nothing more. And we have to do more than that, I think. Now, in terms of what that looks like, Jonathan and I have said, it's you can say to your blue in the face that you want the church to be diverse, but until your table is diverse, the church will never be diverse. And that's something we fail at over and over again. If we're assuming that the church will suddenly become diverse without us allowing these same people into our homes, then something is lost. And I don't think we get that. And Jonathan and I don't know. That was where we landed probably 2 or 3 years ago. It's we want to ask people, when you say, why is our church not more diverse? It's why is your table not more diverse? Tell me how many minorities have sat around your table in the last 6 months. And I think that's a huge part of it. This is about relationship, it's about friendships, and it's about a deep trust that has to be formed for a person to feel comfortable. Because you and I both know that what we believe about God is one of the most intimate secrets of who we are, right? When I begin to share that with you, when I begin to pray with you and worship alongside you, I'm bringing you into the most intimate part of who I am. And you can't just do that with somebody you're not really sure about, right? And so it's like all of this begins with relationships being formed. And if we forget that, then we've lost something. It doesn't mean that a person can't walk in the door and then the relationship will be formed. Absolutely. But you can't assume that because they walked in the door, then that's enough. Now we're diverse. Now everything is good. It's like, no, there are all these intentional steps that have to be taken. And one of those, I think, again, foundational ones, stepping stones to all of this, is like we just have to bring one another to the table, into our homes. We have to bring people who are different than us. We have to surround ourselves with these folks. We have to buy from people who are different from us. We have to put our kids in schools with people who are different than us, and seek out relationships at the baseball field or the soccer field or wherever else where you have these opportunities to build friendships. Like, these are great opportunities. And not just think about it as like, what can we do on Sundays that's different? It's that and all the rest. So that's a long answer, sorry.
We have another question.
Look at you guys coming out.
I'm going to take a second to read through it all, and then
Okay.
also I'm going to let people know that if you're listening to this, we've had some serious camera issues tonight. So we're back to a black screen with just audio, and that's the way it's just going to be for the rest of the night, I guess. But we can still all talk and hear each other.
Yeah.
So I guess what they're asking is, as white people, this may be really difficult for us to answer, but do we think that there is a role, or what's the role of a black person's part in all this? Are they do they also need to be responsible for reaching across the lines? Thinking about that, like through all the pain and the trauma that they've experienced, and that they've had to like just sort of swallow with all of the microaggressions and the under the surface racism that they've experienced again and again at the hands of white people. How would you recommend for someone in that experience? And what should their expectations be? Or as white people, I guess, like as a church that's predominantly white, what are our expectations, or what are we doing when those people come in the door, is the kind of follow-up caveat to that question.
Yeah. I think, yes, an African American person can play a role in all of this. I think we have to be careful about how much we say they should play a role in this, right? Like that they have to play a role in this. Like how much of this is the language of responsibility. It's like obviously as believers, they share a responsibility in this because all believers are to forgive as they've been forgiven, right? That's the pattern of what it is to follow Jesus. Like we pray that daily. Jesus gives us that to pray. Father, forgive me as I forgive. Like that's the language you use. So it's like obviously they have a role to play in that sense of trying to seek reconciliation and forgiveness in this way. But the thing we have to consider is that we can't force a further burden on their shoulders in all of this. They've already carried a heavy weight in all of this thing. And so I think the white church has to be the ones that we don't presume on their responsibility in all of this. And we don't come to the table expecting that they'll do as much of the work as we would. Like this will be something where like we need to kind of take up our cross. Like this is our cross to take up. I think that's my conviction in that regard. And that's not easy, but I think we have to approach it that way. And I think we have to be the ones to extend a whole lot of grace in this regard, rather than like creating these very hard and fast rules, building up barriers and boundaries and saying, this is as far as I'm willing to go on this. I'm not willing to step out anymore. Like we always have to be the ones who are stepping out. And again, that doesn't mean always that won't be happening, because there are some incredible black believers who are going to be so mature and so moved by the Spirit that they're going to be the ones that start bridging these gaps. And we can embrace that. We can celebrate that, but we just can't presume upon that and expect that that's the way it's going to happen all the time. I think more of the weight is upon the white church. And again, that's not about guilt. That's just about us recognizing the significance of of reconciliation, the way it all plays out in the church. Like, we have to be the ones who are doing this. Like, it's been clear. I think their role is what Jesus describes. Remember when Jesus talks about conflict resolution, the way we normally think of it is like, if somebody's done you wrong, you go and you tell them, you did me wrong. Jesus says, no, 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 no. If somebody has done you wrong, they may not even realize it. You have to go to them and address it. You have to deal with it in this different sort of way. They're not supposed to come to you and apologize, right? Like, we expect that when we go and tell them that they're going to make this all good, like, it's different than the way we've normally conceived of it. Maybe I said that wrong. We're expecting that a person's going to show up at the door and then we'll be able to forgive them. It's like they don't even realize sometimes their sin. And Jesus creates this different pattern. It's like, no, 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 you've got to take the first step in reconciliation. And I think African Americans have taken that step over and over again. They're trying to make clear, like, we are deeply wounded by the things that have been done to us in our past in this country. And we've been defined by it in a very dark way. And we have to be those who are taking that step in terms of not just apology, but real repentance and repair and what that looks like. I think that's ours, so.
Yeah, I was going to say that in week 1 we talked about some of that, about how the onus has to fall on white people in a lot of ways, and not just on us to apologize. And this is where we get into the anti-racism stuff of, like, there's some real responsibility, especially in a predominantly white community, where, one, we don't unduly place the burden on the handful of people that are, you know, black or other people of color in our community, but, like, that we kind of step in. What we were talking to Tatiana about that week of, like, hey, like, part of the role is for us to get out in front of that and, like, to confront white people on behalf of people of color in some of those things of saying, like, what you were getting at is, like, white people don't just get a pass because they were uneducated. Like, we've got to step up and say, like, no, it was wrong whether you knew it was wrong or not. Like, whether you knew that was offensive or not, it was offensive. And as white people, I think we can begin to say those types of things to create space for, like, people of color that have just been unduly burdened with that again and again and again, starting to step up and to correct one another. So I do, like you were saying, I mean, that sounds like, again, I guess because we're white people, we're only going to really speak on behalf of what the response of white people should be.
Sure.
But it will take both. There's no doubt about that. Like, I mean, it will take both people making an effort. But I do think that the larger burden is on, by and far, it's on white people. Yeah. Like, there's no question about that. And because the reality of it is, too, it is multicultural, or all these things we want to talk about that America is slowly becoming. I mean, this last few months has just proven we're still a really, really far way. And you can go through the statistics of people in office, CEOs, the actors that get paid the most money. I mean, like, what we see and what we experience is still predominantly controlled by white voices and white faces. And so, I mean, like, we're the ones that still are in that space. And so I think it's our responsibility to continue to open those doors to allow other people into those spaces. But, like, I mean, we have to do that work. And we can't be, the other thing I would say, too, to white people listening, and this was something it took me a little while to learn, but, like, we can't be mad at our black friends or some that we meet when we're like, look at me, I tried really hard. I'm a good white person. Like, don't you want to be my friend? And it's like, well, there's a lot there. What the question is getting at, there's a lot of hurt. There's a lot of pain under that. And like, we can't just expect everybody to trust us immediately on the surface. So,
yeah,
I would say that to the people
Rod?
listening. Yeah, Rod, you're our elder
You want to speak to that? We're saying that we have a very white sort of response to it. You may have ideas about what you think the African American believer's role would be in terms of reconciliation. You may not necessarily have like a defined answer, but what would your reply to all of that be?
Well, from my perspective, when I hear things like that, I think about Dr. Bob and Bill. When they speak on making amends, even though it's not an amends, it's important to just clean off your side of the street.
Sure.
If you think you've done something, anything you can do to make it better, then you do that. If the person receives it, then they receive it. If not, keep moving, because the step work is designed to fix your part.
Mm-hmm.
You're not responsible for how they receive what you do.
Sure.
Long as you do it with the honest compassion from your heart, that's all you can do.
Yeah.
Because everybody is not going to receive you. Same way it is with the steps. Everybody's not going to forgive you for what happened when you was using. They're not going to forgive you. Oh, you still that same person. I don't hear that.
Yeah.
All you can do is do the best that you can do and keep moving.
Yeah.
I think people who want a different way of life will embrace it. I don't really see race period in myself. I like all people. I like all music. I grew up on Rod Stewart in high school. He's my favorite singer. So, so I think just as long as the person is willing to make an amends or to embrace something else, not an amends, to willing to embrace someone, if the person don't receive you, then that's on them.
Sure.
That's on them. So.
Yeah.
The thing you said earlier when you were saying about the 70s, when I was growing up, it was a certain type of car that was in our neighborhood. I grew up in a place called Kingston Projects. My mom and father, they divorced when I was young, and we stayed on a place called College Hill. And we would see a Mercedes-Benz or a Jaguar. We would say, that's a white man car. You know what I'm saying? It was just certain things that
Of course it was, yeah, right?
It was just certain things you knew wasn't going to be in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? We seen Chevys and hot rod like a Dodge Charger or a Cadillac. But those are things that was always represented to us in those areas. So, I just had that thought when it came up. So
Yeah.
I don't know why I came up with this.
Yeah. Well, because it's real. Yeah. Like you connect these thoughts to experiences. Yeah. Because that's it.
Yeah, but I think, man, that you guys do a great job as far as I'm concerned, being who you are, being loving, being Christians. And anybody who don't receive that, that's on them. That's on them. So, that's on them.
Yeah, I think we're just plagued by self-doubts to an extent. I think I think we can overthink. It's like a funny thing. It's like, guys, we spent how many centuries worshiping in this divided sort of way, or in this, again, if we weren't divided, we were creating still these barriers. It's like, yes, obviously you're going to worship with us, but I'm still your master and you're still my slave. Like, obviously that was happening for a very long time. Whites and blacks went to church together. That was a norm. And then it got a little uncomfortable. And that was when other denominations started to break off, right? When they began to form their own sort of worship practices and their theology began to be shaped by their experience in a different sort of way. And they began to actually read their Bibles because they were educated and they went, wait, this doesn't sound right. This doesn't sound like what you're preaching. Like, that created this rift. But I think for so long we've just overthought it, and like we're prone to these self-doubts and like, well, I don't want to be guilty of this, right? I don't want to be guilty of cultural appropriation, or I don't want to be guilty of tokenism or voyeurism or all of these sorts of things. Like, I don't want to romanticize or kind of like step into the black church in this experience because it's a cool conversation or it feels exotic to me. It's like all of these like self-doubts, and it's just like sometimes we just have to be willing to step into it, or sometimes we have these like. We talked a little bit about this in the first week, maybe last week. We get uncomfortable with, aspects of certain churches' theologies or whatever else, or what the guy's preaching and how he's going. And it's just like you forget. It's like, man, that's further down the road. Like, that's a conversation to be had when you really have a relationship with somebody, and not okay, so hard pass, you and I can't be together because you said that during. Like, that's reconciliation is costly and sacrificial, and we'll have to kind of get past some of those things in order to have those conversations.
A lot of times we just overthink it.
Oh, yeah.
I think just the effort to even have it on your heart to even want to do it.
Yeah.
It's a star by itself.
Yeah.
Whether anything is coming to fruition or not,
Yeah.
But the effort, and thought. Jonathan.
When we've done, Jonathan and I have preached black funerals in our church for Frankie and Jelona. I spoke at Mr. Charlie Mack Roberts, who used to live with Frank, used to give her a place to stay. I've spoken at those funerals, and every single time I've got nothing but kindness from these people. Like, they come up and they're just, and the thing about it is they're not just like, hey, that was real good, Pastor. It's just like, no, they're like, I'm not used to this. Forgive me that a white guy would speak that affectionately about somebody who was not white, or that he is like, that's not normative. I'm not accustomed to this, and it was a blessing. Like, and it's just like, all I've ever gotten is affirmation, and it's like, and that doesn't mean I didn't make missteps. I mean, I'm sure I've made mistakes or gone about it wrong at some point, but all I ever get is affirmation. It's like, I've played in African American churches back home. I can remember taking a worship band and jumping into a completely different context, and all they had were kind things to say because they knew it was about more. It's like, yeah, they were sitting there going, these white kids can't play music like we can. Like, they're playing a completely different thing, but all they wanted to do was affirm us because they knew it was about more than just the music. It was about, it's like, wait, you're doing this with us, so we can get past some of this. And it's like we both have to, yeah. So it's like we kind of have to let go of some of those fears. Gosh almighty, we overthink so much. We really do. Like, we spend hours and hours, like, delineating over how we should word something or go about it. And yeah, there's reason for caution because we've certainly been insensitive. But man, like, I think most of the time there's so much grace from not all African Americans, but African American believers are just they're longing for that too. They long to have these sorts of relationships, and they know that it doesn't make sense that the church would be divided like Jews and Gentiles still at this point. Like, they've read Ephesians, they know. So it's just kind of an interesting thing in that regard, but we just can't continue to overthink it.
I totally commend the church for even trying.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you could be doing something entirely different, but God has led you guys hard to do this, so
Yeah.
just keep rocking with it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, guys, thanks for tuning in. For those of you guys, sorry about the technological issues, but I'm afraid they are with us for a very long time with this pandemic mess. But yeah, we're glad you're here. We'll be here next week, the next 2 weeks, I guess, and we're looking forward to that. So yeah, again, if you've got suggestions or questions or whatever else for moving forward in the next couple of weeks, we'd love to hear that stuff. And otherwise, we'll see you guys soon. Blessings. Love you guys.